thought I'd lost everything when my brother died in Afghanistan. But I never imagined his final promise would save my military career and earn me the respect of every soldier who once laughed at me. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The Georgia heat was brutal that morning at Fort Benning, but nothing burned more than the shame crawling up my neck as 23 recruits watched me fail another combat drill. Sweat dripped into my eyes, mixing with tears I refused to let fall. My name is Vivian Chen, and at 22, I was supposed to be carrying on a family legacy that stretched back 3 generations of decorated soldiers. 6 months earlier, my world shattered when that chaplain knocked on our door with news about my brother, Captain Thaddeus Chen. He died saving his unit in Kandahar, leaving behind a silver star he'd never receive, and a little sister who suddenly felt responsible for honoring everything he'd stood for. My father, Colonel Garrett Chen, had served 3 tours before retiring to his desk job at the Pentagon. My grandfather, Sergeant Major Beaumont Chen, still wore his Vietnam service cap to every family dinner. They were warriors, heroes, legends in our small military community. I was just the girl who preferred paintbrushes to pistols and poetry to tactical maneuvers. But when Thaddeus died, something inside me demanded I try to become the soldier he'd always believed I could be. So I enlisted, determined to prove I belonged in the uniform that seemed to swallow me whole. Chen, "You're holding us back again," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez barked as I stumbled through another failed obstacle course run. The other recruits smirked and whispered behind their hands. Cordelia Murphy, a stocky girl from Boston, rolled her eyes dramatically. Dashiell Park, who'd been class valedictorian before enlisting, shook his head like I was some charity case taking up space. I touched the small tattoo on my inner wrist. A delicate compass rose with numbers underneath that most people assumed were decorative. They had no idea those coordinates would change everything. They had no idea my brother had insisted I get this tattoo before his final deployment, making me promise to trust it when I felt lost. "Your brother would be embarrassed," Cordelia whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe you should have stayed home where you belong." Standing there in the dust, surrounded by people who saw me as dead weight, I had no idea that this tiny piece of ink would soon make every single one of them understand exactly what the Chen family was made of. I just knew I was drowning, and the only thing keeping me afloat was a promise I'd made to a brother who'd believed in me more than I'd ever believed in myself. Growing up in the Chen household meant living with ghosts of glory. Every wall displayed military honors. Every dinner conversation revolved around tactics and deployments, and every birthday wish seemed to involve someone putting on a uniform. My father's study was a shrine to service, lined with medals, commendations, and photographs of him standing next to generals in desert camouflage. Grandpa Beaumont kept his Vietnam combat boots polished and displayed on the mantel, right next to the folded flag from his retirement ceremony. I was the anomaly in this family of warriors. While Thaddeus practiced military drills in our backyard, I sketched flowers in the margins of my notebooks. When Dad taught him to field strip weapons, I was upstairs reading poetry. My parents never pushed me toward military service. They'd always said I was their gentle soul, the one meant for different battles. But gentle souls don't replace fallen heroes, and after Thaddeus died, I felt like our family's proud legacy was dying with him. The morning I walked into the recruiter's office, I was running on pure guilt and determination. Dad tried to talk me out of it, saying I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But I needed to prove it to myself. I needed to know if the strength that ran through Chen blood had somehow skipped me, or if I'd just never been tested hard enough to find it. Now, 6 weeks into basic training at Fort Benning, I was getting my answer, and it wasn't the one I'd hoped for. At 5'3" and barely 115 pounds, I was the smallest recruit in Alpha Company. While other soldiers powered through obstacle courses, I struggled to scale walls that seemed built for giants. During hand-to-hand combat training, I spent more time on my back staring at the sky than on my feet fighting. My drill sergeants, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Sergeant First Class Williams, had started using me as an example of what not to do. "If Chen can't make it over that wall, none of you can use size as an excuse," Rodriguez would shout, his voice carrying across the training field like a battle cry. The other recruits learned to dread being partnered with me because my failures became their failures. Cordelia Murphy made sure I never forgot my place in the hierarchy. Built like a linebacker with the attitude to match, she'd grown up in a rough Boston neighborhood where weakness was a luxury no one could afford. "Maybe you should have stayed home with your paintbrushes, Chen," she'd sneer after watching me fumble through weapon assembly. "Your brother would be ashamed watching this pathetic display." Dashiell Park was more subtle but equally cutting. The former class valedictorian from California had enlisted to pay for medical school, and he treated everything like an academic exercise he was destined to ace. He'd shake his head whenever I struggled, muttering calculations about how my poor performance was affecting the platoon's overall scores. Every night in my narrow bunk, I'd trace the outline of my wrist tattoo and remember the day Thaddeus convinced me to get it. He'd dragged me to a tattoo parlor 3 days before his deployment, insisting I needed something to keep me grounded. The compass rose was his idea, delicate enough to match my personality, but strong enough to remind me I always had direction, even when I felt lost. "These coordinates are special, Viv," he'd said, watching the artist carefully ink the numbers below the compass. "If you ever need to find your way, really find your way, trust these. They'll guide you when everything else fails." I'd laughed then, thinking it was just his way of being the protective big brother. Now, surrounded by people who saw me as a mistake in uniform, I wondered if those numbers meant something more. Maybe they were coordinates to a place where I belonged, because it certainly wasn't here among soldiers who'd earned their respect through strength I didn't possess. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the constant criticism. It was the growing certainty that maybe everyone was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this life, and maybe trying to honor Thaddeus's memory was actually dishonoring everything he'd stood for. The breaking point came during week 7, on a Tuesday morning that started like every other nightmare at Fort Benning. The air was thick with humidity and tension as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced we'd be running our most complex combat simulation yet. Teams of 5 would navigate through hostile territory, neutralize enemy positions, and extract wounded soldiers within a strict time limit. Failure meant recycling back several weeks in training. I was assigned to Team Delta with Cordelia, Dashiell, and 2 other recruits who barely acknowledged my existence. As team leader rotated alphabetically, the unlucky honor fell to me. Cordelia actually laughed out loud when Rodriguez announced it. "Perfect," she muttered. "Deadweight Chen gets to drag us all down with her." The simulation took place in a dense forest training area designed to mimic Afghan terrain. We had maps, compasses, and radio equipment, but the real test was decision-making under pressure. 20 minutes in, everything went wrong. Enemy fire erupted from unexpected positions. Our predetermined route was compromised, and 2 team members were designated as wounded and couldn't move without assistance. I froze. Standing there with gunfire simulation echoing around me and my team looking to me for direction, my mind went completely blank. The tactical training I'd struggled to absorb vanished like smoke. Cordelia grabbed my arm and shook me. "Chen!" "What's the call?" I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Dashiell pushed past me, taking charge and leading us down what turned out to be the wrong path entirely. We missed our extraction window, failed to neutralize half the targets, and left our wounded soldiers behind. When the buzzer sounded ending the exercise, we were lost, exhausted, and completely defeated. Rodriguez was waiting at the rally point, his face darker than a storm cloud. In front of the entire company, he tore into our performance with surgical precision, but saved his harshest words for me. "Chen, leadership isn't about wanting to honor your family name. It's about keeping soldiers alive when everything goes to hell. Today your team would be dead because you couldn't make a decision when it mattered." The humiliation burned through me like acid. Every recruit in Alpha Company heard him dress me down, heard him question whether I belonged in uniform, heard him wonder aloud if I was wasting everyone's time playing soldier. After that, the mockery escalated beyond anything I'd experienced. Someone started leaving toy compasses on my bunk with notes like, "Maybe this will help you find your way home." During mess hall meals, conversations would stop when I sat down, replaced by whispered comments about how I was dragging down the whole company's scores. The cruelest moment came 3 days later during dinner. I was carrying my tray to an empty table when Cordelia deliberately stuck her foot out, sending me sprawling across the floor. Food scattered everywhere, and the entire mess hall erupted in laughter. As I scrambled to clean up the mess, trying to ignore the snickers and pointing, Cordelia bent down and grabbed my wrist. "What's this little doodle?" she said loudly, twisting my arm so everyone could see the tattoo. "Your participation trophy? Some kind of good luck charm that clearly doesn't work?" A crowd gathered around us, and I felt exposed in a way that went beyond physical humiliation. This tattoo was the most personal thing I owned, the last gift my brother had given me, and now it was being mocked by people who'd never understand its significance. Maybe if you spent less time getting pretty tattoos and more time learning how to soldier, you wouldn't be such a disappointment, Dashiell added, his voice carrying that clinical tone that somehow made everything worse. That night, I called my father from the payphone outside the barracks. I tried to hold it together, but the moment I heard his voice, I broke down completely. "Dad, I can't do this. I'm failing at everything. Maybe I should just come home." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something I'd never heard before. Disappointment. "Maybe this wasn't meant for you, sweetheart. There's no shame in finding a different path. Your mother and I will support whatever decision you make." After I hung up, I sat in my bunk staring at withdrawal paperwork I'd gotten from the company clerk. All I had to do was sign my name and this nightmare would be over. I could go back to my art, my poetry, my quiet life where nobody expected me to be something I clearly wasn't. I sat there for hours staring at those withdrawal papers, pen in my hand, ready to sign away everything I'd tried so hard to become. The barracks were quiet except for the soft breathing of sleeping recruits who belonged here in ways I never would. My finger traced the compass rose on my wrist, and suddenly I could hear Thaddeus's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. "This will guide you when you're lost. Viv, trust it." Something in those words, in that memory, made me put the pen down. Maybe I was a failure, maybe I didn't belong, but I wasn't ready to give up on the last promise I'd made to my brother. Instead of quitting, I decided to fight harder than I'd ever fought for anything. I started waking up at 4 in the morning, an hour before reveille, to run extra miles in the dark. While everyone else slept, I practiced combat drills until muscle memory replaced panic. I studied tactical manuals by flashlight, memorizing formations and strategies until they became second nature. I stopped trying to make friends and focused solely on becoming the soldier I needed to be. The change didn't happen overnight, but it was happening. My obstacle course times improved. My marksmanship scores climbed from the bottom of the class toward the middle. I could finally field strip my weapon without fumbling, execute basic maneuvers without freezing, and keep up on the longer runs that used to leave me gasping. Cordelia and Dashiell noticed the change with typical cruelty. "Look who's finally trying," Cordelia sneered during one training exercise. Too bad trying and succeeding are two different things. But their words didn't sting the same way anymore. I had something more important driving me now than their approval. 3 weeks into my personal transformation, we got our first weekend leave since starting basic training. While other recruits headed into Columbus to blow off steam, I took a bus to Arlington National Cemetery. I needed to visit Thaddeus, needed to tell him I was trying to become worthy of the faith he'd placed in me. His grave was in Section 60, among the heroes from Iraq and Afghanistan. The headstone was simple white marble with his name, rank, and dates, but no mention of the Silver Star he'd earned. I sat in the grass beside it and pulled out the folder I'd brought, containing every piece of information I could find about his service record. That's when I discovered something that changed everything. Buried in his personnel file, which my father's security clearance had allowed me to access, was a mission report from 6 months before Thaddeus died. The operation took place at coordinates that made my blood run cold, the exact same numbers tattooed on my wrist. I read the report 3 times, trying to understand what I was seeing. Captain Thaddeus Chen had led a rescue mission to extract 12 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. The mission was classified, the location was considered impossible to navigate, and Thaddeus had somehow guided his team through hostile territory, using nothing but field maps and instinct. All 12 soldiers came home alive. My hands shook as I pulled out a more detailed tactical map and cross-referenced the coordinates. The mission had taken place in terrain remarkably similar to the training forests at Fort Benning. Mountainous, dense, with limited visibility and multiple natural obstacles. The kind of environment where traditional navigation tools often failed. Sitting there beside my brother's grave, I finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me. The tattoo wasn't just a pretty symbol or a good luck charm. Those coordinates represented the location of his greatest triumph, the moment when his natural navigation instincts had saved a dozen lives. And somehow he'd known I possessed those same instincts. You always could find things others couldn't, he'd told me once when we were kids, after I'd located his lost dog in woods where everyone else had given up searching. You just see the world differently, Viv. That's not a weakness. That's a gift. I spent that entire weekend studying topographical maps, weather patterns, and tactical approaches to the terrain around Fort Benning. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I was preparing for something instead of just surviving it. When I returned to base on Sunday night, there was an announcement waiting. The final graduation exercise would take place the following week. Teams would navigate through the most challenging course Fort Benning had to offer, a complex rescue scenario that would determine who earned the right to call themselves soldiers. I walked up to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez after the briefing, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Sergeant, I'd like to volunteer as team leader for the final exercise." The entire barracks fell silent. Rodriguez stared at me like I'd just volunteered to walk on the moon, but something in my eyes must have convinced him I was serious. The final exercise began at dawn on a Thursday that would change everything. Rodriguez briefed us on the mission: navigate through 30 miles of dense forest terrain to locate and extract 5 wounded soldiers scattered at different coordinates, then return to base camp within 12 hours. The catch was that each team would take a different route, and mine was marked as the most challenging. Winding through areas where GPS signals were unreliable and standard compass readings could be thrown off by mineral deposits in the rock formations. My team consisted of Cordelia, Dashiell, and 2 other recruits who'd clearly drawn the short straw. As we gathered our gear, Cordelia made her feelings crystal clear. "Just try not to get us killed." "Chen, some of us actually want to graduate." I ignored her, focusing instead on the topographical map and the strange sense of familiarity washing over me as I studied our route. Something about the terrain reminded me of the mission reports I'd read, the way the ridges and valleys formed natural corridors and dead ends. 2 hours into the exercise, we hit our first major obstacle. The marked trail had been washed out by recent rains, leaving us standing at the edge of a ravine with no clear way forward. Dashiell immediately pulled out his compass and map, calculating angles and distances with mathematical precision. "If we backtrack 3 clicks and take the eastern ridge, we can reconnect with the trail system," he announced with typical confidence. But something felt wrong about that route. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize the terrain from above, the way Thaddeus had taught me when we were kids exploring the woods behind our house. In my mind, I could see the eastern ridge leading to a box canyon that would trap us for hours. "No," I said quietly. "We need to go west, through the valley." Cordelia stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "The valley's not even on our assigned route. That'll add miles we don't have." "Trust me," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Dashiell shrugged and started heading east toward his calculated route. Cordelia and the others followed automatically, leaving me standing alone at the crossroads. This was it. The moment where I either proved I belonged here or confirmed everyone's worst assumptions about me. I looked down at my wrist tattoo, those coordinates that had guided my brother through impossible terrain to save 12 lives. "I'm going west," I announced. "Anyone who wants to pass this exercise can follow me." Something in my tone must have convinced them, because after a tense moment, they turned around and fell in behind me. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I led them through terrain that seemed to defy logic, following instincts I didn't fully understand. When the compass readings contradicted what felt right, I trusted my gut. When the map showed obstacles that looked insurmountable, I found alternate routes that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. We located all 5 extraction points ahead of schedule, moving through the forest like we belonged there. My team stopped questioning my decisions and started following them without hesitation. Even Cordelia had gone quiet, watching me navigate with something that looked suspiciously like respect. We were securing the final wounded soldier when Colonel Commander Patricia Hawthorne appeared at our extraction point, having arrived by helicopter to observe the exercise's conclusion. She was a legend at Fort Benning, a combat veteran who'd earned her stars in Iraq and commanded respect from everyone who wore the uniform. As I coordinated the final rescue sequence, calling out positions and timing with precision I didn't know I possessed, I noticed Hawthorne watching me intently. When I raised my arm to signal our successful completion, she stepped forward and grabbed my wrist. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Her voice was sharp, urgent. "My brother gave it to me before his last deployment," I replied, confused by her intensity. Hawthorne's face went completely white. She studied the coordinates more closely, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Captain Thaddeus Chen was your brother?" When I nodded, she continued, "Those coordinates saved my son's life. Lieutenant David Hawthorne was one of 12 soldiers your brother rescued in that classified operation. That mission earned Captain Chen the Silver Star. The forest seemed to go silent around us. My team, the observers, everyone within earshot had stopped what they were doing to listen. Your brother specifically requested those coordinates be recorded because he said his sister had inherited the family gift for navigation. He said you'd need them someday when you found your own way to serve. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The tattoo wasn't just a memorial to Thaddeus's heroism. It was his way of passing on the legacy he'd always known I was destined to carry. The news spread through Fort Benning faster than wildfire in August. By evening, everyone in Alpha Company knew about the Chen family legacy, about the Silver Star mission, and about how the girl they'd written off as deadweight had navigated impossible terrain using coordinates from her brother's greatest triumph. The same recruits who'd mocked me for weeks suddenly couldn't make eye contact, their cruel jokes replaced by awkward silence and uncomfortable shuffling. Cordelia found me that night sitting on my bunk, cleaning my gear for the graduation ceremony scheduled for the next morning. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking over and sitting down across from me. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice stripped of its usual edge. "I thought you were weak playing soldier for attention. I didn't understand what you were carrying." Dashiell approached a few minutes later, his mathematical precision replaced by genuine humility. "Your tactical instincts today were remarkable. I've never seen anyone navigate terrain like that without GPS or advanced equipment. Your brother trained you well." I shook my head. "He didn't train me. He just helped me realize I already had everything I needed." The graduation ceremony took place on the parade ground under a blazing Georgia sun. 200 family members watched as 73 recruits became soldiers, but my moment came when Colonel Commander Hawthorne stepped forward during the honors presentation. "Private Chen, front and center." I marched forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. In her hands, Hawthorne held a small wooden box that she opened to reveal a Silver Star medal, its blue and red ribbon pristine despite being 6 months overdue. This Silver Star was awarded to Captain Thaddeus Chen for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. Due to the classified nature of his mission, it was never presented to his family. She pinned the medal to my dress uniform, her voice carrying across the silent parade ground. "Today, it goes to the soldier who carries on his legacy of courage, leadership, and the rare gift of bringing everyone home safely." My father was in the front row of spectators, tears streaming down his weathered face. Colonel Garrett Chen, who'd served 3 tours and earned his own collection of medals, was crying because his daughter had found her own way to honor the uniform. When he hugged me after the ceremony, he whispered, "Thaddeus would be so proud." We all are. 6 months later, I was selected for officer candidate school, my leadership scores ranking in the top 5% of my graduating class. The same tactical instincts that had guided me through that final exercise made me a natural at reading terrain, predicting enemy movements, and finding solutions when conventional approaches failed. But the real transformation happened in smaller moments. During advanced training, when other candidates struggled with land navigation, I found myself naturally mentoring them, sharing the confidence my brother had passed to me. I learned to recognize that lost look in someone's eyes, the same expression I'd worn for weeks before discovering my own strength. The tattoo on my wrist became a conversation starter rather than a source of shame. Other soldiers would ask about the coordinates, and I'd tell them about Thaddeus, about the 12 lives he saved, and about the gift he'd seen in me long before I could see it myself. Each time I shared the story, I honored both his sacrifice and the potential he'd recognized in a little sister who'd always felt different. A year after graduation, I received my first leadership assignment, training officer for recruits struggling with confidence and basic skills. The Army had recognized what Thaddeus always knew, that sometimes the best leaders are the ones who understand what it feels like to be lost, because they never forget to bring everyone home. On quiet evenings, I still trace the compass rose on my wrist and think about that promise he made me get tattooed before his final deployment. He'd known I'd need guidance someday, coordinates to help me find my way when everything felt impossible. What he'd really given me wasn't just numbers on a map. It was the understanding that strength comes in different forms, and sometimes the people who seem weakest are just waiting for the right moment to prove what they're truly made of. The Chen family legacy didn't end with Thaddeus. It just found a different way to serve.